She arrived in chains of silk and diplomacy, an African princess held captive in a Korean palace, surrounded by 40 armed guards who watched her every breath. He was the captain assigned to be her jailer. One look, and his world shattered. They said she was a prisoner. They said he was just following orders. But when her attendant collapsed and he had to choose between duty and her life, everything changed. One forbidden conversation. One dangerous touch. One impossible love that would cost him everything, his honor, his family, his entire kingdom. But 5 years later, when she walked back into his life, no longer a captive, no longer bound by anyone's rules, she asked him one question that would change everything. Will you choose me this time? 2 kingdoms. 1 love. 0 permission. This is the Iron Gates of Hansong.
The Iron Gates of Hansong opened to receive the delegation on the first day of the frost moon, when the mountains wore white crowns and the city's breath rose like temple incense into a sky the color of polished steel. Captain Shin Dae-jung stood at attention in the outer courtyard of Gyeongbokgung Palace, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword with the practiced stillness of a man who had learned to become stone when duty required it. The cold bit through his uniform, but he did not move. Around him, 40 warriors of the royal guard maintained the same disciplined silence, their armor catching the pale morning light like scales on some great sleeping dragon. They had been told nothing except to wait, to receive, to escort. The delegation came from across distances so vast that most of the men had no names for the lands involved, only vague notions of ships and deserts and kingdoms that existed in the realm of merchant tales and Buddhist sutras. The only certainty was the command itself, delivered from the throne through channels so formal and absolute that to question would be to invite death swifter than the winter wind that now cut across the courtyard stones. Dae-jung had served the crown for 12 years. He had killed bandits in the northern provinces, put down a merchant rebellion in Pyongyang, and stood guard while ministers debated matters of war and succession behind doors he was forbidden to hear through. His loyalty was not a choice, but a condition of his existence, branded into his bones through oaths sworn in blood before the tablets of his ancestors. His father had been a royal guardsman, his grandfather before that. The sword he carried had tasted the blood of traitors, and he kept it sharp for that purpose alone. When the delegation finally appeared at the palace gates, preceded by runners and minor officials whose nervous energy disturbed the morning's frozen stillness, Dae-jung felt something shift in the air around him. The merchants came first, Korean intermediaries who had facilitated this impossible meeting, their faces carefully blank but their eyes bright with the sort of greed that came from brokering the exotic. Behind them walked men whose skin was burned dark by foreign suns, wearing robes of patterns Dae-jung had never seen, carrying standards that bore no resemblance to the banners of the Middle Kingdom or the rising sun. Then she emerged from the covered palanquin, and every assumption Dae-jung had made about the nature of the world reorganized itself in the space of a single breath. She was tall, taller than any woman he had ever seen, with skin the color of polished ebony that seemed to drink the pale morning light and transform it into something richer, warmer. Her bearing was not that of a captive or a curiosity, but of someone accustomed to deference, to power held as naturally as breath. She wore garments of white linen embroidered with gold thread, patterns that suggested kingdoms and languages that existed beyond the edges of any map he had studied. Her hair was braided in elaborate patterns close to her skull, adorned with beads of amber and ivory. When her eyes swept across the assembled guard, Dae-jung felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing, assessing and dismissing them with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood the mechanisms of power intimately. The Lord Chamberlain stepped forward, flanked by interpreters whose linguistic acrobatics would bridge the impossible distance between Hansong and Aksum, between the Hermit Kingdom and the highlands of distant Ethiopia. Dae-jung listened as the formal introductions unfolded in 3 languages, each translation adding layers of diplomatic cushioning to what amounted to a simple fact. Princess Yeshimebet, daughter of the Negus of Aksum, had arrived as part of a trade delegation that was equal parts diplomacy and desperation. Her kingdom sought allies against the encroachment of rival powers, and Korea, in its own isolation, represented a potential partner untainted by the colonial ambitions that plagued the waters to the west and south. But Dae-jung could see what the official pronouncements did not acknowledge. The princess and her small retinue were also hostages, guarantees of good faith in negotiations that could take months or years. They would be treated with the courtesy due to visiting royalty, housed in appropriate quarters, given access to certain privileges. But they would not be permitted to leave, and the 40 warriors of the Royal Guard would ensure this with lethal efficiency if required. The command was given, and Dae-jung's unit fell into formation around the delegation. They would escort the visitors to the Western Residence Halls, a compound of buildings that had once housed Ming emissaries and now stood empty except for the ghosts of old diplomacy. As they moved through the palace grounds, Dae-jung maintained his position at the head of the formation. His awareness split between the path ahead and the woman who walked at the center of this strange procession. She moved with a dancer's grace despite the unfamiliar terrain, her eyes taking in everything with an intelligence that made him uneasy. Most foreign dignitaries who entered the palace complex were either awed into submission by the weight of Korean power or so wrapped in their own importance that they failed to notice the details that mattered. The princess did neither. She noted the positions of guards, the layout of buildings, the distances between gates. She was mapping her prison even as she entered it. When they reached the Western residence, the formal transfer of responsibility occurred with the usual ceremonial precision. The Lord Chamberlain delivered his carefully rehearsed speech about the generosity of His Majesty and the profound honor bestowed upon the visitors. The princess responded through her interpreter, her words equally formal but carrying an undercurrent that suggested she understood exactly what hospitality meant when backed by 40 armed men. Then the Lord Chamberlain turned to Dae-jung and delivered the command that would reshape the trajectory of his life, though he did not yet know it. Captain Shin, you and your unit will maintain constant guard over the Western residence. No one enters or leaves without authorization from the throne. The princess and her attendants are to be treated with respect due to their rank, but they are not to move freely within the palace grounds. They are not to communicate with anyone outside their delegation without supervision. They are not to be alone with any member of the court, any servant, any official below the rank of minister. These orders come directly from His Majesty and are not subject to interpretation or mercy. Do you understand? Dae-jung bowed, the movement so ingrained it required no thought. I understand, my lord. The penalty for failure in this duty is death by slow strangulation, preceded by the execution of your family to the 3rd generation. This is not a threat, Captain. It is a statement of reality. These visitors represent forces we do not fully understand, and His Majesty will not permit any contamination of the realm through carelessness or sentiment. I will not fail, my lord. The Lord Chamberlain studied him with eyes that had witnessed 3 decades of court intrigue and survived by trusting no one. I believe you, Captain. But belief and outcome are not the same thing. Guard your heart as carefully as you guard your post. With that cryptic warning, the Lord Chamberlain withdrew, leaving Dae-jung to organize the rotation of watches and assign positions. He placed his most reliable men at the main entrance and along the perimeter walls, keeping the newer recruits in positions where their inexperience could do less damage. He took the first watch himself, not because protocol demanded it, but because he needed to understand what he was guarding against. As evening settled over the palace and the residence lights began to glow through paper screens, Dae-jung stood in the courtyard and listened to the sounds of the delegation settling into their temporary home. He heard voices in languages he could not understand, the cadence of prayers or songs that followed rhythms entirely foreign to his ear. Once he heard laughter, bright and unexpected, and realized with a start that it came from the princess herself. The sound disturbed him more than threats or weapons would have. It suggested she was not afraid, or if she was, she refused to show it. It suggested she saw this captivity as temporary, a problem to be solved rather than a fate to be endured. It suggested she was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical force. He pushed the thought away and focused on his duty, counting his breaths in the pattern his first instructor had taught him, letting the cold air fill his lungs and empty them in steady rhythm. He was a warrior sworn to the throne. His life belonged to the crown, not to himself. Whatever happened within these walls, he would observe, he would report, and he would not allow his own thoughts or feelings to compromise his purpose. But as the night deepened and the stars emerged in patterns he had learned to read as a boy, Dae-jung found himself wondering about the princess and her impossible journey. What desperation had driven her father to send his daughter across oceans and deserts to seek alliance with a kingdom that barely acknowledged the existence of her people? What strength did it require to maintain dignity while being held hostage in a land where everything, from language to food to the very air itself, was alien? These were not questions a guard should ask. They were weaknesses, small fractures in the stone he had made of himself. He noted them the way he noted potential security breaches and resolved to address them with the same ruthless efficiency. The next morning brought the first complication. One of the princess's attendants, a woman named Hannah, who served as both companion and advisor, approached the courtyard gate and asked, through gestures and broken syllables, if they might walk in the gardens. Dae-jung's second-in-command immediately refused, citing the Lord Chamberlain's orders. The woman persisted, her voice rising in frustration until the princess herself appeared at the residence entrance. She spoke in her own language, the words flowing like water over stone, and the attendant immediately fell silent and bowed. Then the princess turned her attention to Dae-jung, who had come forward to assess the situation. She studied him with the same appraising gaze he had noted the previous day, and when she spoke, it was in careful, heavily accented Korean that suggested she had been learning the language long before arriving in Hansong. "We are prisoners?" The directness startled him. Most courtiers and foreign visitors wrapped everything in layers of polite fiction. He considered his response carefully, aware that anything he said could be reported to the throne. "You are honored guests under the protection of His Majesty, guests who cannot leave their rooms, prisoners, guests whose safety requires certain precautions." "Against what? We have no weapons. We are few. Your palace has thousands of soldiers. What danger do we present that requires 40 warriors to watch 4 women and 3 merchants sleep?" She asked the question he had asked himself but had no authority to answer. He could only enforce the orders given, not explain them. "I do not make policy, princess. I follow commands." "And if commands are unjust?" The question was a trap, possibly a test. Any answer he gave could be used against him. He chose his words with the precision of a man diffusing explosives. "Justice is determined by those with the authority to judge. I am a sword, not a magistrate." Something flickered in her eyes, disappointment or recognition, he could not tell which. A sword that thinks it is only a sword will eventually cut its own hand. Before he could respond, she switched to her own language and gave instructions to her attendant. The 2 women withdrew into the residence, and the morning's confrontation ended without violence or further incident. But Dae-jung felt the weight of her words settling into the space between his ribs, an uncomfortable pressure that his usual disciplines could not quite dissolve. Over the following weeks, a pattern established itself. The delegation lived within their prescribed boundaries, the guards maintained their vigilant watch, and official business proceeded through formal channels with all the efficiency of palace bureaucracy, which meant slowly and with maximum ceremony. Ministers came and went, always accompanied by interpreters and scribes who recorded every syllable exchanged. Trade agreements were discussed in theoretical terms. Geographic intelligence was gathered under the guise of cultural exchange. The princess and her attendants were paraded before court officials like exotic specimens, examined and evaluated with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Dae-jung observed all of this from his position as guardian and jailer. He saw how the courtiers stared at the princess, some with open contempt, others with the sort of prurient curiosity usually reserved for animals in menageries. He heard the whispers that followed her movements through authorized spaces, the speculation about the color of her skin, the texture of her hair, whether she was fully human or some intermediate creation that existed in the blurred space between civilized people and beasts. He was conducting an unscheduled inspection, his instincts warning him that festivals created the exact sort of distraction that enabled security failures. He found the princess outside the residence, not in the approved garden area, but near the perimeter wall, looking up at the stars with an expression of such profound loneliness that it struck him like physical force. She sensed his presence and turned, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she spoke, her voice carrying a weariness that went beyond diplomatic exhaustion into something closer to despair. "Do you know what day this is, Captain? In my calendar, I mean, not yours." He did not, of course. The tracking of her homeland's festivals and holy days was not part of his briefing materials. "It is the Feast of Mescal, the celebration of the True Cross. In Aksum, the entire city would be gathered in the Great Square, and my father would light the bonfire that marks the beginning of the festivities. There would be singing, dancing, prayers that last through the night. And here I am watching your people celebrate something I do not understand, missing ceremonies that shape my soul as surely as breath shapes the body." Dae-jung knew he should escort her back to the approved areas, file a report about the security lapse that had permitted this small escape. Instead, he heard himself saying, "Tell me about it. The celebration. Your tradition." She looked at him with surprise that slowly transformed into something deeper. A recognition that he was offering her something more valuable than freedom of movement. She was offering memory, identity, the chance to be more than a political symbol for a few moments. So she told him about Mescal, about the legend of Helena finding the true cross, about bonfires that created light to defeat darkness, both literal and spiritual. She described the dancing, the elaborate church ceremonies, the way her entire kingdom came together in celebration that transcended politics and warfare and all the other divisions that normally kept people separate. As she spoke, her hands moved in patterns that suggested the dances she described, and her voice carried rhythms of songs he could not understand but could feel. And Dae-jung found himself mesmerized, not by the information itself, but by the passion with which she delivered it. This was not the diplomatic princess performing for foreign courts, this was Yeshimebet, daughter of Aksum, sharing the parts of herself that captivity had forced into silence. When she finished, they stood in shared quiet, the sounds of Korean celebration distant and irrelevant. Then she smiled, and it transformed her face into something so openly human that Dae-jung felt all his carefully maintained defenses shatter like pottery dropped from height. "Thank you," she said simply, "for listening, for allowing me to be homesick without judgment. That is a gift I did not expect to find here." "You should return to the residence," he managed, his voice rougher than intended, "before my men complete their rotation and discover you've been outside approved areas." "Of course. The guard must guard even when his heart wishes otherwise." She meant it as observation, perhaps even gentle mockery of the system that trapped them both. But Dae-jung heard it as recognition that the fiction of professional distance between them had become untenable. She knew. He knew. And now they both knew that the other knew, which made everything infinitely more dangerous. He escorted her back to the residence entrance, maintaining proper distance and official bearing. But as she passed through the doorway, her hand brushed against his for the briefest moment, and the contact burned through him like fire through dry grass, destroying in an instant what months of discipline had been trying to preserve. After that night, Dae-jung stopped lying to himself about what was happening. He did not act on his feelings, did not violate his orders or her honor, but he also stopped pretending that duty was the only force shaping his choices. He began to understand what his uncle had warned him about, the difference between watching from the edge of a cliff and preparing to fall. The autumn brought change in forms both obvious and subtle. The trade negotiations finally produced a preliminary agreement, enough progress that some ministers began advocating for the delegation's return to Aksum with treaty documents for the Negus' consideration. The princess's captivity, which had stretched from winter through spring through summer, seemed finally approaching some form of resolution. But resolution, Dae-jung was learning, was not the same as conclusion, and endings were rarely clean. What began to change was the quality of attention between them. Before, their interactions had been brief, formal, carefully bounded by the roles they performed. Now, something more complex was emerging, a silent conversation conducted through glances and studied absences, through the precise timing of his rounds and her appearances in the garden. They were learning each other's patterns the way musicians learn a shared rhythm, creating a language that existed in the spaces between official discourse. Hannah noticed first. The older woman began appearing whenever the princess and Dae-jung occupied the same space, her presence a deliberate reminder that witnesses existed, that foolishness had consequences, that whatever magnetic force drew two incompatible people together could not override the fundamental realities of power and prejudice. She did not speak her warnings aloud, but her eyes said enough, and both Dae-jung and the princess understood they were being offered a chance to step back from the precipice before falling became inevitable. Neither took that chance. Perhaps they told themselves they were simply two people trapped in circumstances beyond their control, finding solace in mutual recognition of their predicament. Perhaps they convinced themselves that respect could be contained, that admiration need not become desire, that two warriors acknowledging honor in each other was not the same as wanting what could not be had. Perhaps they were fools, or perhaps they simply could not help what was happening any more than autumn leaves could help falling when the wind demanded it. The crisis, when it came, arrived not through dramatic revelation, but through the smallest of accidents. Dae-jung was inspecting the residence walls, checking for deterioration that might compromise security, when he heard raised voices from within. Not anger, but distress, and his training had long since taught him to distinguish between different forms of alarm. He moved toward the sound and found the princess in the main reception room, standing over Hannah, who had collapsed while helping rearrange furniture. Without thinking, Dae-jung entered the residence, a direct violation of his orders. The princess was already kneeling beside her attendant, trying to assess the problem while speaking urgently in her own language. When she saw Dae-jung, she switched to Korean, her usual composure fractured by fear. Her heart. She has had problems before. I need medicine, the physician who came before, please. Dae-jung knelt beside Hannah and felt for her pulse, finding it rapid and irregular. He had seen this condition before, usually in older soldiers after forced marches, and knew it could kill quickly if untreated. His uncle might be able to help, but fetching him would require leaving his post, violating orders again, compounding the pattern of insubordination that had been growing like ice on a winter pond. He looked at the princess and saw in her eyes something beyond fear for her attendant. He saw the knowledge that she was asking him to destroy himself for them, to sacrifice everything he had built his life around for the sake of people his kingdom barely acknowledged as human. He saw her preparing to release him from the request, to tell him he had done enough already, that duty must come first. Stay with her, he said, already moving. Keep her calm, keep her breathing steady, I will return. He did not wait for response or permission. He found his second in command, gave orders that were simultaneously truthful and misleading about needing to consult with palace physicians regarding a medical emergency, and left before questions could complicate action. His uncle lived in the merchant quarter, a distance that could be covered quickly by a man who had trained for speed since childhood. He ran through streets that were transforming from afternoon commerce to evening leisure, ignoring the stares of people unused to seeing royal guardsmen in full sprint, and reached his uncle's house as the sun touched the western hills. The older man asked no questions, simply gathered his supplies and followed. They returned to the palace through Dae-jung's usual channels, the spaces between official observation that guards learned to navigate. But getting to the western residence required passing more checkpoints, explaining to more people, creating more witnesses to behavior that could not be fully explained without revealing the unravelable. By the time they reached Hannah, she was breathing but barely conscious, her skin carrying the gray pallor that preceded death. Dae-jung's uncle worked with practiced efficiency, administering herbs and pressure techniques while asking the princess questions about the woman's history, her symptoms, her previous episodes. The princess answered with precision, and Dae-jung watched them work together, healer and royal, united in the simple purpose of preserving life, and thought that this was how humanity was supposed to function, stripped of politics and hierarchy and all the other constructs that made cruelty seem sophisticated. Hannah stabilized slowly, her color returning and breathing easing into more natural rhythms. When crisis clearly passed into mere recovery, Dae-jung's uncle turned to him with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal concern. This is the second time, nephew. The first could be explained as mercy. The second begins to look like pattern. Patterns attract official attention the way blood attracts sharks. I know. Do you? Because I suspect you know intellectually, but have not yet accepted it in the way that preserves life and family. You are my sister's son, and I love you, but I will not help you the third time. Not because I lack compassion, but because I have learned that some people are determined to destroy themselves, and participation in that destruction helps no one. You think I am destroying myself? His uncle glanced toward the princess, who was sitting beside Hannah, holding the woman's hand while whispering what sounded like prayers. I think you are a good man caught in a situation that does not accommodate goodness. I think you have confused mercy with something else, and that confusion will cost you more than you currently understand. And I think she knows this as well as I do, which makes you both fools, though perhaps noble fools, which is the most dangerous kind. After his uncle departed, Dae-jung remained longer than security required, ostensibly to ensure Hannah's condition remained stable, but actually because leaving felt impossible. The princess sat with her attendant through the evening, refusing to move even when the other women brought food and pleaded with her to rest. Dae-jung stood in the doorway, technically present, but also trying to maintain some fiction of professional distance, and failed completely at the latter. Finally, deep in the night when Hannah had fallen into healing sleep, the princess rose and approached him. They stood facing each other with a space of perhaps 5 feet between them, a distance that felt simultaneously vast and non-existent. You risk too much for us, she said quietly. Apparently I have a pattern of that. It must stop. I cannot be the reason you lose everything. You are not the reason. My choices are the reason. Choices made because of me. That is the same thing. No, Dae-jung said, and heard his own voice carrying certainty he had not consciously accessed. It is not the same thing. You did not ask to be brought here. You did not create the system that makes your presence a problem. You are a person trying to survive circumstances you did not choose. I am a guard trying to remember that guarding is supposed to protect people, not just enforce rules. That philosophy will kill you. You understand this? I am beginning to. She moved closer, reducing the space between them to perhaps 3 feet. And Dae-jung felt his pulse accelerate in ways that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with want. In my country, we have a saying, the heart that crosses boundaries creates new kingdoms or destroys old ones. I think we are both standing at that crossing, Captain. We can step back. Choose differently. The trial proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency, testimony gathered and analyzed, evidence weighed and debated. The princess testified as she had promised, describing Dae-jung's conduct as exemplary within the constraints of difficult assignment. She noted his professionalism, his respect for protocol, his careful maintenance of boundaries, even when mercy was required. She characterized their relationship as one of mutual respect between warriors who understood duty's demands, nothing more improper than recognition between equals, forced into temporary proximity. Dae-jung's testimony mirrored hers, emphasizing her cooperation, her dignity under trying circumstances, her understanding that captivity required acceptance of limits. He acknowledged the medical interventions, but framed them as necessary exceptions to general rules, decisions made to preserve life that was valuable to ongoing negotiations. He described feelings of respect and admiration, but carefully avoided language that could be interpreted as romantic or sexual attraction. The strategy worked partially. They created enough ambiguity that execution became difficult to justify without appearing to punish mercy itself. But the court could not completely exonerate Dae-jung without appearing weak on discipline. So compromise was reached through the mechanism that courts excel at when clarity threatens stability. Dae-jung was stripped of his rank and expelled from the royal guard. His record was marked with failure of duty, though not quite bad enough to extend to family disgrace. He was forbidden from entering palace grounds and relieved of all military obligations. In effect, he was exiled from the only life he had known, cast out into civilian existence without the structure or purpose that had defined his identity since childhood. The princess and her delegation were to be sent home within 2 weeks. The treaty negotiations concluded with minimal agreement and maximum face-saving on both sides. The official pronouncement characterized the exchange as successful, though everyone understood it was failure disguised as diplomatic courtesy. The princess would return to Aksum with little to show for months of captivity, except proof that Korean alliance was more trouble than benefit. On his last day in uniform, Dae-jung stood in the courtyard where he had first seen the princess emerge from her palanquin, where winter had given way to spring to summer to autumn in the space of one impossible year. He was permitted to see her one final time, though under full supervision and with explicit instructions that no private conversation was authorized. She received him in the Western residence reception room, dressed in the formal garments of Aksumite royalty, her preparations for departure already visible in packed belongings and stripped quarters. They greeted each other with the formal bows of officials concluding business, and for several minutes they maintained that fiction while guards watched and interpreters stood ready to record anything resembling impropriety. Then she spoke, in Korean now flawless from months of immersion. Words chosen for official consumption but carrying meanings meant for him alone. Captain Shin, I wish to express the gratitude of the Aksumite delegation for your service during our visit. Your dedication to duty while maintaining recognition of our humanity was noted and appreciated. You have shown me that honor exists beyond cultural boundaries, and I will carry that knowledge home as treasure more valuable than any treaty. Dae-jung responded with equal formality, his words a mirror to hers in structure but distinct in specific acknowledgement. Princess Yeshimebet, it has been an honor to serve in capacity that allowed me to understand that wisdom and dignity are not limited by origin or appearance. You have taught this guard that true nobility lies in how one maintains self when all external supports are stripped away. That lesson will remain long after our paths diverge. The translators recorded these statements dutifully, hearing nothing but diplomatic courtesy. But the princess and Dae-jung both knew they were saying goodbye to something that had never been officially allowed to exist, acknowledging loss that could not be grieved publicly, closing a chapter that history would record as mere footnote to failed negotiations. As she prepared to leave the room, the princess paused and added one final statement, this one in her own language with translation following. The words were prayer or blessing from her religious tradition, asking her God to protect a righteous person walking difficult path. The translators recorded it as cultural courtesy, unremarkable and appropriate to the moment. But Dae-jung heard in those foreign syllables something more intimate. A benediction that said she would carry him in her heart across oceans and deserts. That distance would not dissolve what they had built. That some loves endured precisely because they remained unconsummated by anything except recognition and respect. He bowed one final time and left the western residence, walked through palace grounds that would no longer be his territory, and passed through gates that closed behind him with finality. He removed his uniform that evening in the small room he had rented in the merchant quarter, folding the garments with care despite knowing he would never wear them again, and tried to imagine a life defined by something other than duty to throne and kingdom. The princess departed 3 days later in a processional that was smaller than her arrival, attended by fewer officials and less ceremony. Dae-jung watched from a distance, just another face in the crowd that gathered whenever palace business spilled into public streets. He saw her palanquin pass, curtains drawn against curious stares, moving toward the port where ships waited to begin the impossible journey back to her homeland. He did not expect her to acknowledge his presence, did not want her to risk any gesture that might be noticed and used against her during the vulnerable period of travel. But as the palanquin drew level with where he stood, the curtain shifted slightly, and he saw her face for a moment, her eyes finding his in the crowd as if she had known exactly where he would be. No words passed between them, no gesture that observers would note. But in that brief exchange of recognition, Dae-jung felt everything they had left unsaid compress into a single moment of perfect understanding. Then the palanquin moved on, the procession continued, and she was gone from his life in every way except memory. In the weeks that followed, Dae-jung struggled to construct meaning from the ruins of his former existence. He found work as private guard for merchant families, his skills still valuable even if his honor was questioned by those who knew his story. He sent money to his mother and sister, enough to maintain their security if not quite enough to erase the shame his dismissal had created. He avoided the areas of the city where former military colleagues gathered, knowing his presence would be an uncomfortable reminder of how quickly career could dissolve when conscience collided with command. He thought about the princess constantly, wondering if she had reached Aksum safely, if she had been received with honor or shame, if the treaty failure had diminished her standing or strengthened her credibility as one who refused compromise with kingdoms that treated her people as curiosities. He had no way to obtain answers, no channels through which information from distant Ethiopia would reach a disgraced guard in Korean merchant quarter. 6 months passed, then a year. The sharp edges of loss began to dull into chronic ache, painful but manageable, the way old injuries settle into permanent limitation that body learns to accommodate. Dae-jung developed routines that gave structure to days no longer organized by military discipline. He trained in the mornings, maintained his fitness and combat skills from habit rather than purpose. He read in the afternoons, books purchased from merchants who imported texts from China and occasionally further west, seeking understanding of world that his former life had kept carefully distant. He learned about Aksum's history, about the Highland kingdoms and their ancient Christianity, about trade routes that had connected Africa to Asia for centuries before Korea's isolation. He read accounts from travelers who had visited Ethiopian courts, descriptions of architecture and ceremony that made him recognize how limited his own understanding had been when first assigned to guard the Western residence. The knowledge came too late to change anything, but it settled some restless part of him that needed to understand what he had lost, to give context to the person who had disrupted his entire existence through her mere presence. Then, on a cold morning in early winter, nearly 2 years after the princess's departure, a messenger arrived at the merchant house where Dae-jung was working as security chief. The man was Korean, but had clearly traveled extensively, his clothes showing wear from long journey and his manner carrying the cautious confidence of someone who navigated multiple worlds professionally. "Shin Dae-jung? I am he. I have message for you, from Aksum." Dae-jung felt his heart accelerate dangerously. "From whom?" "I was instructed not to say, only to deliver this if I could locate you, and to wait while you read it in case response is desired." The letter was written in Korean, the calligraphy careful and formal but unmistakably hers. "Captain Shin, if this letter reaches you, it means the merchant I entrusted it to was successful in navigation that spans seasons and kingdoms. I write to you from my father's court, where I have returned to resume duties that feel both familiar and strange after my time in your land. I am safe." Though that word feels inadequate to describe life that continues in wake of what we endured together. The treaty we failed to complete has been forgotten by official memory, but I carry its lessons in places no scribe records. I think of you often, wondering if your life has found new shape after destruction of its former structure. I should tell you that I have married as politics required, a union that serves my kingdom's needs, if not my heart's desires. My husband is good man who understands that political marriage asks for duty rather than passion. He knows there is part of me that remains in distant place, and he is kind enough not to demand what I cannot give while appreciating what I can offer. This is not confession designed to hurt you, but acknowledgement that we both must live in world as it exists rather than as we might wish. I carry you with me as you likely carry me, and that is its own form of faithfulness, even if it resembles nothing the priests or officials would recognize. I write because I wanted you to know that your influence extends beyond your former kingdom's borders. The dignity you showed me shaped how I now govern my own people. The mercy you demonstrated, despite cost to yourself, informs how I approach justice as leader rather than captive. You made me better person and better princess, and I wanted you to hear that directly rather than letting silence be our final conversation. If your circumstances have improved, I hope you have found peace in whatever form it takes. If you still struggle with aftermath of what we became to each other, know that struggle is shared and honored by someone who understands its weight. I do not expect response, as I know correspondence between us creates risk for both our situations. But if you choose to send word, this messenger can be trusted with reply. He will carry it back to Aksum and deliver it to me alone, or if you prefer, he will simply confirm that you received this letter and are living, which would itself be information I value. I remain, with respect and memories that time cannot diminish. Yashimbe. Dae-jung read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning in carefully chosen words. She was safe, but changed. Married, but not content. Living, but carrying same weight he carried, the permanent displacement that came from recognizing what could have been, but never was. He sat with the letter for a long time, considering response or lack thereof. To write back was to maintain connection that had nearly destroyed them both. To remain silent was to let her believe he had moved on, found peace, stopped carrying torch for impossible love. In the end, he chose the middle path that felt most honest. He returned to the messenger and handed him enough silver to ensure reliable delivery, then spoke words the man was to memorize and repeat verbatim. Tell her, I received the letter. I am living. I am changed. I carry what we built with honor despite its weight. She should do the same and not look back toward kingdom that could not recognize what honor looks like when dressed in unexpected forms. Tell her she made this guard remember why guarding matters. That is gift I return across distance that separates us. The messenger repeated the words until he had them perfect, then bowed and departed on journey that would take months to complete. Dae-jung watched him go and felt something shift inside. Not quite healing, but acceptance that healing might someday be possible. He kept the letter, hiding it among his few possessions, and took it out occasionally when the weight of normal life felt too heavy, when the loss threatened to pull him under. Reading her words reminded him that what they had built was real, despite never being consummated, that love could exist without possession, that some forms of faithfulness looked nothing like the official versions. 3 more years passed. Dae-jung established himself as skilled security consultant, his services in demand among merchant families who valued competence over former military honors. He trained young guards in techniques that emphasized protection over violence, mercy alongside discipline, and occasionally allowed himself to believe he was building something worthwhile from the ruins of his former life. He never married, though opportunities presented themselves. Not because he maintained some romantic notion of eternal faithfulness to the princess, but because he had learned that love required space to breathe, and his heart felt too full of complicated memory to make room for new intimacy. He told himself this might change eventually, but he did not push against it. Then came the evening when everything changed again, when the world proved that endings were rarely final and that sometimes impossible things became merely difficult. He was supervising security at Merchant House that was hosting delegation from Western trading partners, routine work that required attention but not intense focus. The delegation had arrived that afternoon, and Dae-jung had conducted standard assessment of their security needs, coordinated with local authorities, and prepared his staff for several days of heightened vigilance while merchants discussed prices and terms. He was reviewing the next day's schedule when his second-in-command appeared with expression that combined confusion and urgency. Sir, there is someone who insists on speaking with you. From the delegation. Says she knows you from previous work. Dae-jung's instincts signaled warning. Delegations from the West rarely included people he would have worked with during his military career. Did she give a name? No, sir. Only said that you would understand the reference if told she was looking for the guard who remembered humanity. The world tilted slightly, and Dae-jung had to steady himself against the desk. It was impossible. The princess was in Aksum, married, ruling her people, living life that had moved on from their brief intersection. This was someone else, a case of mistaken identity or confused reference, something that would dissolve into mundane explanation once investigated. But he followed his second to the reception area anyway, his heart doing things that had no business occurring in a security professional conducting routine work. The delegation was gathered in the main hall, merchants and advisors and guards in the mixed dress that characterized caravans traveling across multiple jurisdictions. And standing slightly apart from the others, wearing the simple clothes of traveler rather than princess, was Yashimebe. For a moment that stretched beyond normal time, Dae-jung could not move, could not speak, could not process what his eyes were reporting as fact. She looked different, yet exactly the same, older in ways that had nothing to do with physical age, wearing experience like additional garments that changed her outline without altering her essential shape. When her eyes met his, he saw in them the same complexity he remembered, intelligence and strength mixed with vulnerability she showed only when she chose to. She spoke first, her voice carefully neutral for the benefit of the merchants who were watching this exchange with varying degrees of interest. I was told you might be able to provide security consultation for our delegation. We have documents that require careful handling, and your reputation suggested expertise in such matters. The words were professional, appropriate to the setting, giving him the space to accept or deny the fiction she was offering. But underneath the formal request, he heard the question she was actually asking. Can you accept my presence here without immediately demanding explanations? Can we navigate this impossible situation one careful step at a time? He found his voice, though it emerged rougher than he intended. Of course, I would be pleased to discuss your requirements. Perhaps we could speak privately to assess the specific nature of your security needs. She nodded, and he led her to one of the consultation rooms the merchant house maintained for sensitive discussions. Once inside, with the door closed, they stood facing each other, the careful pretense dissolving now that witnesses had been left behind. I should not be here, she said before he could speak. I know this. I risk much by coming, both for myself and for you. But I needed to see you again before accepting that the life I built after our separation was the only life I would ever have. What about your husband, your duties to Aksum, the marriage you described in your letter? My husband died 2 years ago, killed in a border skirmish with rival kingdom. He was good man, as I said, and I mourned him sincerely. My father wanted me to remarry immediately, to cement new alliance through matrimonial bonds. I chose instead to join diplomatic delegation as observer, claiming I needed to understand trade relationships before committing to another political marriage. That was excuse. Yes. The truth is, I needed to know if what I have carried these 5 years was memory becoming more beautiful through distance, or if the connection we found was real enough to survive years and continents and all the ordinary life that happens in between extraordinary moments. Dae-jung moved to the window, needing to look at something besides her face while he processed emotions that threatened to overwhelm the control he had spent years cultivating. And now you are here. What changes? I don't know. That is the honest answer. I came because I had to know, not because I have planned for what comes next. But I also came because I was tired of living half-life, pretending that duty was enough to fill the spaces you occupied. You should not have come. The words emerged harsh, defensive, trying to rebuild walls that her presence was demolishing simply by existing. You should have stayed in Aksum, remarried as your father wanted. Let what we were become just story you tell yourself on difficult nights. Coming here risks everything you rebuilt. I know, but I am also princess who chose this risk with full understanding of consequences. You do not get to protect me from my own choices, Captain. I am not your charge any longer. You were never truly my charge. You were always more than the role they assigned you, as you were always more than the guard who watched my door. They fell into silence that contained years of unexpressed feeling, compressed now into a small room in Merchant House that had never been designed to hold such weight. Dae-jung turned from the window to face her directly and found her watching him with the same intensity he remembered from their conversations in the Western residence courtyard. What do you want from me, Yeshimebet? He used her name without title, a intimacy they had never permitted themselves during her captivity. What do you imagine can happen here that is different from what happened before? I imagine we are no longer prisoner and guard. I imagine we are both adults with agency our former situations denied. I imagine that perhaps the world has changed enough in 5 years that 2 people from different kingdoms might be permitted to choose each other without it being crime. The world has not changed that much. Perhaps not the entire world. But we have changed. I have learned that kingdoms do not own people absolutely, that duty has limits, that sometimes the most important loyalty is to truth rather than tradition. Have you not learned similar lessons? He had, of course. His dismissal from the royal guard had been education in how quickly institutions abandoned individuals when convenient. But he had also learned that choices had consequences beyond oneself, that personal desire could damage people who depended on you, that love was not always enough to overcome practical realities of power and prejudice. Even if I had learned such lessons, what future could we have? You are still Princess of Aksum. I am disgraced guard working as merchant security. We have no kingdom that would accept us together, no community that would see our union as anything but scandal. We would be exiles everywhere, belonging nowhere. Yes, she agreed, and the certainty in her voice startled him. We would be exiles. But we would be exiles together, which is different than being exile alone. I have spent 5 years trying to belong in the only kingdom I ever knew, and discovered that knowing a place does not mean fitting there anymore. You changed me, Captain. Showed me that there are ways of being human that my culture does not acknowledge. I cannot unknown that, cannot unfeel the expansion of who I might become if not constrained by expectations of proper African princess. What you describe is abandoning everything for uncertain future with person you spent less than a year knowing in circumstances designed to distort normal relationship. What I describe is choosing life that feels true over life that looks appropriate. I am 32 years old. I have fulfilled my duties, served my kingdom, made sacrifices that politics demanded. I am asking if perhaps I might be permitted to choose for myself for once, to build something that serves no purpose except our own happiness. Where would we go? He asked, and heard in his own question the beginning of surrender. There are places in the world that exist between kingdoms. Port cities, trade centers, places where many peoples mix and no single authority controls absolutely. We could go to Gwangju or Malacca or ports along the spice routes where African and Asian merchants have traded for centuries. We would be unusual perhaps, but not unique. Not the first people to build lives outside the kingdoms that birthed them. And do what? How would we survive? I have resources. Wealth that my father gave me, intended for dowry but mine to deploy as I choose. You have skills that are valuable anywhere security is needed. We would not be rich by royal standards, but we would be comfortable by most measures. And more importantly, we would be free to choose each day what we build together. It sounded like fantasy, the sort of dream people entertained when reality became too heavy but never actually pursued because cost was too high. But Dae-jung also heard in her proposal something that transcended mere escape. She was offering partnership built on mutual recognition, shared values, respect that had been tested through hardship and survived intact. That was not fantasy but foundation, rare and precious because so few people ever found it. I would need time, he said carefully, to settle my obligations here, to make arrangements that do not leave people dependent on me without warning. I would need to talk with my family, explain in ways that do not shame them further. I could not simply disappear. I understand. The delegation will be in this city for 2 weeks while trade discussions proceed. I can wait that long while you consider whether possibility becomes choice. And if I decide the risk is too great, if I choose safety over uncertainty? She smiled, and it carried sadness but also acceptance. Then I will return to Aksum, resume the life I built there, and know that I tried. That I gave us one chance to be more than memory. There is honor in trying, even when trying leads to nothing but confirmed loss. They stood looking at each other, two people who had been shaped by impossible circumstances into forms that fit together despite all logic suggesting otherwise. Then, slowly, carefully, with full awareness that they were crossing boundary that had been maintained through years of discipline, Dae-jung closed the distance between them. Their embrace was tentative at first, bodies remembering forgotten permission to touch, to hold, to acknowledge physical dimension of emotional connection. But then, memory gave way to present moment, and they held each other with the fierceness of people who had been denied this simple comfort for far too long. I am afraid, he admitted into her shoulder, his voice muffled but honest. Good. Fear means you understand what you would be risking. Only fools proceed without fear. What if we destroy each other? What if what we built under pressure of captivity cannot survive ordinary life? Then we will have tried and failed. but I would rather fail attempting something real than succeed at life that feels like elaborate performance. They held each other until the merchant's staff began to wonder what security consultation required such extended private discussion. Then they separated, adjusted clothes and composure, and returned to performance of professional interaction. But something had shifted, and both knew it. Over the next 2 weeks, Dae-jung navigated the careful balance between responsibility and desire. He spoke with his family, explaining in terms they could not fully accept but might eventually understand that he had opportunity to leave Korea, to build different life in place where his past would not define his future. His mother wept and called him selfish. His sister was more understanding, perhaps because she had married for love against family preference and recognized similar impulse in his choice. He settled his accounts, transferred his responsibilities to trusted colleagues, and prepared for departure that felt simultaneously like liberation and abandonment. He was leaving the only land he had ever known, walking away from culture and language and all the reference points that made the world comprehensible. He was choosing exile in pursuit of something he could not even name with certainty, following women he barely knew by conventional measures toward future that existed only in imagination. It was terrifying. It was also the most honest thing he had ever done. On the morning of departure, Dae-jung stood in the port that had received the princess 5 years earlier, watching ships being loaded with goods destined for ports across the known world. The delegation was preparing to board vessel that would take them south along the coast, eventually reaching waters where African and Asian trade routes intersected. Yashimbe waited near the gangplank, dressed in travel clothes that suggested neither royalty nor poverty, carefully occupying that middle space where people could pass through the world without attracting unwanted attention. When she saw Dae-jung approaching with his modest baggage, her face transformed with smile that held relief and joy and lingering disbelief that he had actually chosen this path. "You came," she said simply. "I came, though I reserve right to panic at regular intervals during journey. Panic is permitted. So is doubt. So is regret. We are building something unprecedented, which means we will not always be certain we made right choice. What we will be certain of? Each other. That seems sufficient foundation for whatever comes next." They boarded together, not touching in a way that would scandalize observers, but standing close enough that their shoulders brushed as ship prepared to leave port. As vessel pulled away from dock, Dae-jung watched Korea recede into distance, the mountains and coastline becoming smaller until they were just dark shapes against sky, then nothing but memory. He felt loss of it, weight of choosing to leave homeland that had raised and shaped and eventually expelled him. But he also felt lightness, the relief that came from no longer trying to fit into space that had never quite accommodated his actual shape. He was, as Yashimebe had predicted, exile. But he was exile who had chosen exile rather than having it imposed, and that made all the difference. The journey south took 3 months, stopping at various ports for trade and resupply. During that time, Dae-jung and Yeshimebe negotiated the complicated transition from impossible dream to daily reality. They learned each other's habits and irritations, discovered that proximity revealed both beauty and difficulty, and found that love built on respect was actually quite durable when tested by ordinary life's frictions. They also learned practically what it meant to be people without clear category. In some ports, their mixed-race pairing drew stares and comments ranging from curiosity to hostility. In others, they were just 2 more travelers among the countless people who moved through trading centers in pursuit of commerce and opportunity. They developed strategies for navigating prejudice, learned which communities were safe and which were dangerous, and slowly constructed the skills required to live in the spaces between kingdoms. Eventually, they settled in Malacca, a port city that was itself a mixture of cultures and languages, where Malay and Chinese and Arab and African traders had been mixing for centuries. It was not paradise, and they were not entirely welcomed, but they also were not unique. There were precedents for people like them, couples who had crossed boundaries and survived to build families that existed in the beautiful chaos of cultural intersection. Dae-jung found work providing security for merchant syndicates, his skills valued and his past irrelevant to men who cared only about competence. Yashimbe opened small school teaching languages and writing to children of merchants, using the education she had received as princess to serve the practical needs of families who needed their children to navigate multiple worlds. They were not rich by the standards of their former lives, but they were comfortable. More importantly, they were building something that belonged to them, a life shaped by their choices rather than others' expectations. They made mistakes, had arguments, struggled with homesickness and cultural displacement, and all the ordinary difficulties of two strong people learning to build partnership. But they also laughed, made love, created small rituals and traditions that were theirs alone, and discovered that choosing each other daily was different than the dramatic declarations they had made in Merchant House consultation room. 5 years passed in their new life, then 10. They did not have children, partly by choice and partly by circumstance of Yashimebet's age when they began their life together. But they created family nonetheless, gathering around them small community of other displaced people, exiles and refugees and voluntary wanderers who had also chosen to live outside the careful boundaries kingdoms maintained. Occasionally, news would reach them from Korea or Ethiopia. Dae-jung learned that his family had eventually made peace with his choice, that his sister's children heard stories about the uncle who had left to seek fortune in southern ports. Yeshimebet heard that Aksum had weathered political changes, that new alliances had been formed, that her absence had eventually been explained as tragic death rather than abandonment because that story served better purposes. They mourned the parts of themselves that had been erased by official histories, the way their actual stories were replaced by convenient fictions. But they also recognized that erasure was price of freedom, that choosing to be real meant surrendering claim to the lives they might have had if they had accepted the roles prepared for them. On evening of their 15th year together, they sat on the balcony of their modest house overlooking Malacca's harbor, watching ships arrive from all directions carrying goods and people and stories from every corner of the world. Dae-jung, now 52 and showing gray in hair he had always kept precisely trimmed, leaned back in his chair and asked a question that had been forming for months. Do you regret it? Leaving Aksum, abandoning your position, choosing life with disgraced guard over future as ruler? Yashimbe, nearly 50 and even more beautiful to his eyes than the young princess he had first guarded, considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I regret that world is arranged so that our choice required abandoning everything else. I regret that kingdoms cannot accommodate people who choose across boundaries. I regret that we could not have both our love and our homes. But the choice itself? No. The choice itself I defend absolutely. I built life that belonged to me rather than performing role that belonged to kingdom. That is not small thing, even when it costs much. We built life together, Dae-jung corrected. I was disgraced guard with no future until you appeared again and offered possibility. And I was widow trapped in cycle of political marriage until you chose to risk everything one more time. We saved each other, I think. That seems fair trade for kingdoms lost. They sat in comfortable silence, watching sunset over water that connected their current home to the homelands they had left behind. They were exiles, as she had predicted they would be. But they were exiles together, which meant they belonged somewhere after all. In the small kingdom they had built from mutual choice and daily recommitment to seeing each other truly. It was not the ending either had imagined when they first met in Palace Courtyard all those years ago. But it was ending they had earned through courage and sacrifice and willingness to believe that love was not weakness, but foundation strong enough to build life upon. Years later, long after both had died and been buried in Malacca's mixed cemetery where people from every kingdom rested side by side, their story would be told occasionally by old merchants who remembered the African princess and the Korean guard who had chosen each other over everything their worlds had prepared them to be. The details would shift and blur with retelling, as stories do when passed through generations. But the core would remain constant. Two people who had met as captor and captive, who had recognized honor in each other despite every reason to see only enemy, who had built love in spaces where love was forbidden, and who had finally chosen to live that love even when it meant becoming exiles in every land except the small space they created together. It was not story that would appear in official histories of Korea or Ethiopia, but it was true nonetheless, true in the way that matters most, true in the way that changes two lives absolutely, and leaves the world only slightly different, but somehow more possible than before. They had been fools, as his uncle said. Noble fools who chose principle over survival, love over safety, authentic life over comfortable performance. And in being fools together, they had discovered that wisdom was not found in following rules, but in knowing which rules to break, when to break them, and who to break them for. The kingdoms continued as kingdoms do, maintaining their boundaries and hierarchies and careful separations. But in the spaces between, in the port cities and trade routes and places where cultures mixed beyond official control, their story lived on as evidence that other ways were possible, that love could cross boundaries, that people who chose each other could survive the disapproval of empires. It was small victory in grand scheme of history. But for two people who had been told repeatedly that their connection was impossible, it was everything. And sometimes, in the measurement that actually matters, everything is enough.